Victor stood beside the window in the hospital corridor, his brow furrowed. Hanging up the phone, he looked up and stalked off with purpose in his step. A heavy silence filled the car. Sensing his assistant's furtive gaze, Victor turned and said in a soft voice,
"Something on your mind?"
"You've only just been discharged, sir. You should go home and rest. Your other responsibilities..."
Victor didn't respond, instead resting his chin on his hand and turning to look out the window. Goldman wanted to continue, but after a moment's hesitation, decided it was best to remain silent. Thinking back to the time he saw Victor in quarantine, covered in blood, a little shiver ran up his spine. Rain began to fall, gathering in rivulets on the window. The brake lights ahead refracted red and white through the glass, and everything became obscured through the curtain of rain. Victor couldn't help but to think of the last time he saw her 1 month ago. It was raining then, too. Standing in front of her, his clothes soaking wet, his heart bursting with the joy of recovering what he thought was lost. He was determined to change the outcome that time. Fragments of memories rushed to the surface, threatening to overwhelm him. His breathing became shallow and ragged. He saw the bullet ripping through space towards her. He saw himself throwing himself in front of her, blood spilling from his stomach onto her dress. He saw himself raise the dagger, his hand trembling like a leaf. Redness flooded his vision. Clumsily, he tried to wipe away her tears, only to smear blood on her pale white cheek. Bright red lights brought him to his senses. He held her tightly, one last time.
No matter where you are, I'll always fight.
The pain of having his soul torn apart swept through his body. Clenching his teeth, he used his last remaining strength to tear a hole in space-time and sent the girl through. His right hand trembling, Victor knew what he must do, even if it meant going back in time. He had not spoken of it in all the days since, though dreams disturbed his sleep and the gunshot scar on his belly ached with every movement. Victor clenched his fist, his stern expression and chiseled jawline set in stone.
"LFG, sir."
Victor looked up, a shadow of pain in his eyes. As the darkness fell, the sky became devoid of starlight. Victor stood at the window, watching the traffic creep along the street below. The city lights filled the night. This was where he first told her about his perspective.
When the whole city is at your feet, your anxieties just melt away.
Thinking about her unexpected expression, a hint of a smile played across Victor's lips, and his eyes softened. But the smile quickly vanished. In a far corner, untouched by light, there stood a dark figure. Approaching footsteps could be heard, slowly and steadily in the silence. Victor turned to face this visitor, his expression cold and distant.
"I've been looking for you."
The time observer nodded, stopping at the boundary of light and dark, half his face still hidden in shadow.
The world timelines are collapsing. Time is running out.
Victor did not speak. The lights spilled in from outside, lengthening his features as the darkness intensified. A profound silence filled the space, as if two invisible forces were confronting one another. After a pensive moment, the time observer spoke.
We can tell you her current location.
For the first time, Victor's tranquil expression revealed a trace of surprise. He paused, then muttered a single word.
"Fine."
Astonished by the frankness of his answer, the time observer continued.
You must understand the consequences of these actions.
"I told you, I have only one objective."
His tone was completely uncompromising. The time observer smiled, offering his outstretched hand to Victor.
"But everything else is my domain."
Victor stood his ground, unshakable determination engraved upon his face. An unreadable expression flashed across the time observer's face as he turned and disappeared into the darkness with a sigh. As the night deepened, the lights went out one by one on the streets below, as if the city itself was falling asleep. Victor stood alone on the balcony. Suddenly, a ringtone broke the silence. Frowning, he picked up the phone. Goldman's panicked voice was on the other end.
Sir, we have a problem. The Special Task Force has released a list of evolvers. Your name is on it.
The car slowly pulled up outside the office building. Victor appeared calm and collected, while his driver and bodyguard scanned the street for possible threats. Ever since Victor had been outed as an evolver, protesters had been gathering outside the entrance to the LFG building. The revelation had caused quite a stir, and the company's share price had taken a hit. Fortunately, most people were reasonable, and Victor's stellar reputation allowed LFG to mitigate the situation. As he got out of the car, Victor noticed the protesters weren't at the usual spot at the front of the building, but instead had gathered around a flower bed off to the side. At its center, he caught a vague glimpse of a boy. Despite his uncertainty, he quickly headed towards the scene. The boy's clothes were torn and his face was red and swollen. There were tears in his eyes, but he stubbornly pursed his lips taut and refused to let them fall. Upon seeing Victor, the protesters became even more agitated, hurling insults at him and the boy, who, as it turns out, was also an evolver. Glancing at the crowd behind him, Victor saw his bodyguards push the protesters back, and the sounds of the commotion gradually faded into the background. Looking at the boy, Victor saw the steadfast stubbornness in his eyes. A familiar figure swam into Victor's mind, superimposing itself on the boy's features. Victor smiled kindly.
Where do you live? I'll take you home.
The boy stared blankly, then scowled, as though he was about to cry again. Victor held out his hand.
Let's go.
Victor led the boy to his car. All the while, the boy tried to secretly wipe his tears away. Victor silently handed him a tissue. Did she cry like this when she was little? Victor wondered to himself, though he quickly rejected the notion. No, she never cried much in front of him, as a child or otherwise.
Such a stubborn dummy.
That's what she was. Victor smiled unconsciously to himself. His eyes softened as he looked out the window, thinking of her. Would everything be different if she returned? Arriving at the boy's home, his parents fell over themselves with gratitude. In conversation, Victor learned they had lost their jobs because they were evolvers. But despite their difficulties, they didn't appear too concerned. On the contrary.
They'll pay for it one day.
With confidence in his eyes, the boy's father shook his fist. Blind optimism. He'd seen it somewhere else before. Realizing the connection, Victor's eyes softened, and he smiled briefly.
I can give you an opportunity.
The couple appeared stunned. Victor repeated the offer a bit more seriously this time.
But I'm not a charity. If you want to come and work at LFG, you'll need to show me what you can do.
A lot of emotions passed through Victor's mind. He remembered the look of the girl at one of those meetings. She proved to him once and for all that evolvers possessed a light that could not be concealed. Word that LFG hires evolvers spread like wildfire, and very soon, the company was receiving hundreds of CVs from hopeful evolvers. Reading through them, Victor discovered many talented people who had lost their opportunities because of their status. A thought began to crystallize in Victor's mind. His phone lit up, and an alert about LFG's share price on the rise interrupted his musings. Unconcerned, he swiped it shut. Victor's gaze slowly swept over the cargo ship docked on the shore. The crew were all going about their business. The area had become a center for evolver communications. Suddenly, something grabbed Victor's attention. Not far away, he saw the boy he had returned home a few months back. The boy was aiming a gun. Victor rushed towards him, and the boy turned and pretended to shoot, imitating the sound of a gun with his mouth. A scene flashed through Victor's mind. Slowly he pulled the trigger. The barrel was dead on target. A man with burn marks on his face. The girl was there as well, but he himself was holding the gun to her as he made his exit from the chaotic scene. He felt as though he was being strangled. Fragmented memories came flooding in, reassembling themselves in Victor's mind. He stood in place, his right hand quivering slightly. The boy stopped at the sight of Victor and panicked.
Sorry.
His thoughts interrupted. Victor swallowed, his Adam's apple quivering slightly, and an unreadable expression flashed across his eyes. Quickly, he regained his composure. Victor strode over to the boy and held out his hand.
Give it to me.
The boy hesitated for a moment, then handed over the gun.
It's just a toy.
Puzzled, Victor looked down at the toy gun in his hand.
Why aren't you at school?
The boy grimaced.
The other kids avoid me. The teachers do too.
Victor's eyes became distant. After a moment of reflection, he spoke deliberately.
That's not a good enough reason for you to skip class. Go to school and leave the rest to me.
The boy nodded. Realizing that perhaps his tone was a little harsh, Victor hesitated. He patted the boy lightly on the head and gently spoke.
Go on now.
The boy didn't leave immediately, but looked up at Victor with eyes full of gratitude and admiration.
Thank you for helping us. Everyone says you're a good person.
That said, he ran off. Victor was a bit startled. Watching the boy run off, a small, self-deprecating smile played across Victor's lips. Images of the gun, the girl, and the sudden drop of the dagger flooded his mind. Feelings of intense fear and regret swept over him. He was always hurting her, one way or another. Victor shoved his hands into his pockets and stared out to sea. His turbulent emotions were reflected in the churning waters below. After a moment of silence, he spoke, to no one in particular, or perhaps just to himself.
It's not over yet. I will win our wager.